Hello, class, and welcome to This Week in Developmental Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will be your instructor for this course. Within this week's lesson, we will be taking a look at prenatal development. Now, there's some characteristics of prenatal development. And although this period is relatively short, you have just that roughly 9-month period, there are a number of important characteristics that we need to highlight. To begin with, the hereditary endowment, which serves as the foundation for later development, is already fixed once and for all. Now, while favorable or unfavorable conditions, both before and after birth, may and probably will affect to some extent the physical and psychological traits that make up the hereditary endowment that is received at conception, it does not change the quantity or quality of what is received. Second off, there are favorable conditions in the mother's body that can foster the development of hereditary potentials. But at the same time, any unfavorable conditions, any toxins, can stunt or disrupt development, or can distort the patterns of future development. And so we need to be mindful of that as well. The sex of the newly created individual, physical sex, is fixed at the time of conception. Now, there can be some variability in there. Sometimes you can end up with a complicated scenario like a double XY individual rather than an double X or XY. But it's always fixed at the time of conception. And conditions within the mother's body may change development, but it will not change the hereditary endowment. Now, surgery can be used in sexual transformation cases, but it does not change the genetic potential that is initially there. Next, greater growth and development takes place during the prenatal period, more so than any other time throughout the individual's entire life. During that first 9 months before birth, the individual grows from a microscopically small cell to an infant who measures approximately 24 inches in length and weighs approximately 7 pounds. And that rate of relational development just cannot be matched at any other time. But it also means that that is a very sensitive time to the environment. The prenatal period is also a time of many hazards, therefore, and these can be both physical and psychological. While we can't say that it is the most hazardous time, there are certain environmental factors that can mark the pattern of physical development profoundly during this period of time. So that's something that we need to be mindful of. And the prenatal period is also a time when significant people form their attitudes towards newly created individuals. And these attitudes will have a marked influence on the way these individuals are treated, especially during their early formative years. So, when the significant people in the prenatal person's life are emotionally weighted, that can play a huge role in the homeostasis of the environment within which that prenatal child grows up in. For example, if there's a great deal of emotional disruption, for example, in the mother's life, then that throws off the entire condition of the mother's body and can have significant impact upon the fetus's development. Before birth, the fetus, blood circulation, respiratory, nourishment, elimination, and temperature regulation are all accomplished through its connection with the mother's body. And so there's some very important things that we need to be mindful of here. Let's start off with the circulatory system. Before birth, mother and baby have independent circulatory system and separate heartbeats, but the fetus's blood is cleansed through the umbilical cord, which carries blood to and from the placenta. At birth, the body's own system must then take over, so the neonate's heartbeats is still fast and it's still irregular, and blood pressure doesn't stabilize within the newborn child until about the 10th day after birth. So the circulatory system is fully interdependent early on, before birth, and even after birth is very erratic and difficult to stabilize. Then there's the respiratory system. The fetus gets oxygen through the umbilical cord, which also carries away carbon dioxide. So the newborn who needs much more oxygen must now get it independently. Most infants start to breathe as soon as they emerge into the air. A baby who does not breathe within 2 minutes after birth is in trouble. If breathing has not begun in 5 minutes or so, some degree of brain injury from anoxia, which is a lack of oxygen, is going to result. And sometimes the infant's lungs have only 1/10 as many air sacs as adults. And so infants are susceptible to respiratory problems. And that can be very concerning. And when you have a newborn and they're struggling to breathe, and it becomes very obvious very quickly if there is a problem. Then there's the gastrointestinal system. The fetus relies upon the umbilical cord to bring food and carry body wastes away. The newborn child has a strong sucking reflex to take in milk and has gastrointestinal secretions to digest it. Now there's a meconium, which is that stringy greenish black waste matter formed in the fetal intestinal tract, and that is excreted during the first few days or so after birth. And so you need to kind of be aware that when a child is born, that first week is going to be the strangest, most nasty poops you will probably ever see. When the neonate's bowels and bladder are full, the sphincter muscle will open automatically, and many months will pass before the baby can actually control the muscles of the bowels and the bladder. And so that is part of the reason why there isn't potty training for a significant period of time. Now, 3 or 4 days after birth, about half of all babies and a larger portion of babies born prematurely develop physiological jaundice, which is an immaturity of the liver. Their skin and eyeballs will begin to become yellow, and this kind of jaundice is a direct result of the immaturity of the liver, and usually is not that serious and has no necessarily long-term impacts, and is typically treated by putting a baby under fluorescent lights, which will begin to break down the components within the blood that is causing the jaundice. And then there's temperature regulation, and there's a layer of fat that develops during the last months of the fetal life that enables healthy, full-term infants to keep their body temperature constant despite changes in air temperature. Newborn babies also maintain body temperature by increasing their activity in response to a drop in air temperature. So shaking, movement, will all become part of what a infant will naturally do in order to keep their blood pressure or their blood temperature at a specific level. Now, let's go back and take a look at that neonatal, the prenatal process from fertilization and conception onwards. So that process is where we have the sperm and ovum fuse to form a single cell. And in most cases, this will occur about 14 days after the beginning of the woman's menstrual cycle. The new single cell then formed by those two gametes or sex cells from the ovum and the sperm, and that single cell is called a zygote. Once this zygote duplicates itself again and again through cell division, then we have the beginnings of the growth of the prenatal individual. At birth, a human female has about 400,000 immature ova in her two ovaries, each ovum in its own small sac or follicle. The ovum is the largest cell in the human body. From the time a female matures sexually until menopause, ovulation occurs about once each menstrual cycle. So for most women, that's about 28 days. A mature follicle in one ovary ruptures and expels its ovum. The ovum is swept through the fallopian tube to the tiny hair cells called cilia toward the uterus or womb. And it is in the fallopian tube that if the ovum meets a sperm cell, fertilization normally occurs. The sperm cell, shaped like a tadpole, is about 1/600th of an inch from head to tail, and it's one of the smallest cells in the body. Sperms are produced in the testicles and the testes in the male, and they reproduce and at a rate of several 100 million per day. And these are ejaculated in the semen at sexual climax for the male. The sperm enters the vagina and begins to swim up through the opening of the cervix, the neck of the uterus. From the uterus, they head into the fallopian tube, but only a few sperm actually get that far because there are many protective layers to protect the health of a woman. So about 20 million sperm must enter a woman's body at any one time to make fertilization likely. But only one of them can fertilize an ovum to conceive a new human being. From the time of ejaculation, sperm maintain their ability to fertilize an ovum for about 48 hours. An ova can be fertilized for about 24 after release from the ovary. So you have this window of about 48 hours during each menstrual cycle when sexual intercourse can result in fertilization. Sperm reach a woman's reproductive tract up to 24 hours after. Before or after the ova is released, are capable of fertilizing that ovum, therefore. And if fertilization does not occur, the ovum and the sperm cell in the woman's body, the sperm are absorbed by the woman's white blood cells, and the ovum passes out into the uterus and exits through the vagina. If the sperm and ovum do meet, they conceive a new life and endow it with that rich genetic heritage that each individual receives prenatally. Now, let's talk about environmental and hereditary influences here for a moment, because psychologists and other social scientists have attempted to find the influence of heredity and environment on individuals. People have asked this question for years, and the answer seems to differ depending upon what traits we're considering. Some physical characteristics like eye color and blood type are clearly inherited, but more complex traits having to do with health and intelligence and personality are subject to the interplay of both heredity and environmental factors. And how much of a given trait is influenced by heredity and how much is by environment is difficult to answer. And then you have, on top of that, epigenetics, where environmental factors turn on and off certain genes. So let's take a moment and explore what determines the chromosomal sex of the child, as well as genes, gene expression, gene abnormality in this section of the lecture. So what determines the chromosomal sex of the child? 22 chromosomes from each parent, and these are of similar length. You can see these matched, and the 23rd pair of chromosomes contains either two X chromosomes or an X and a Y. Half of sperm contain a Y chromosome. All of the ova contain X chromosomes. If the 23rd position contains two X chromosomes, the child will be female. If it contains an X and a Y, the child will be male. But, and this is sometimes you can, very rare occasions, have a double XY, where a person can genetically be either male or female, and then it depends upon what hormones are expressed, what physically develops. Now, some people will ask the question, can you select for either a male or female child? Well, with technology being the way it is, there are actually possibilities there. There's a company called Microsort that allows couples to select for the sex of their child to either balance their offspring by sex, or if they're known carriers of sex-linked disorders, they can select out. Now, what you end up with sometimes with twins is you can either have monozygotic, and mono means one, zygote means fertilized eggs, and here you would end up with twins that are genetically identical. And they occur when a single fertilized egg splits apart after conception, and each begins to develop as an individual. And so These identical twins are less common than non-identical and usually share the same phenotype, of that same appearance. And then there's the dizygotic twins. Occurs when two eggs are released and fertilized by two separate sperms. They do share the same DNA. They don't share the same DNA. Rather, they are as genetically similar as any two siblings from the same biological parents would be. Then we have genes and gene expression. And I just want to kind of highlight a few words here that sometimes you may hear associated with genes and gene expression. The word genotype refers to the actual genetic material maintained and contained in your cells. It is your genetic code. The word phenotype refers to the physical traits that are actually expressed in a person. It's what you see when you look at the person next to you. And so it is the expression of the genes, the coding of the genes that's being expressed, not the ones that are unexpressed. So what determines the expression of genes? Some traits are expressed based upon an additive pattern or the average of all the other genes that you've inherited. Things like height and skin tone are traits that follow such patterns. Of course, your actual height can also be reduced by a lack of nutrition. Other traits follow a dominant or recessive pattern, which means that if dominant genes are paired with recessive genes in your chromosomes, the dominant genes will be expressed. Curly hair is dominant gene linked. Red hair is a recessive trait. Some genes are expressed even though a particular member of a pair or allele is not totally dominant. Some alleles share dominance. For example, having wavy rather than straight or curly hair may be a result of partial dominance. And then environmental factors can also trigger your makeup. One example is the relationship between oxygen deprivation triggering pain for those with sickle cell anemia. That's an example of an environmental factor. Now, there can also be abnormalities in genes. Now, let's turn our attention to some of those abnormalities that are associated with chromosomes and genes. Chromosomal abnormalities occur when there is more than 23 pairs of chromosomes in cells. The most common cause of these abnormalities is maternal age. There's some evidence that the age of the father can also be correlated with the increased risk of some kinds of diseases, but there is more of a established relationship to the mother. The most common chromosomal abnormality is Down syndrome, usually caused by an additional copy of genetic material on the 21st chromosome. The likelihood of these increases, again, with maternal age. It's estimated that half of all zygotes contain an abnormal number of chromosomes. Trisomy, for example, can occur on the 13th or 18th chromosome. Usually, the organism is non-viable if this occurs on positions other than the 21st or 23rd chromosome. Now, trisomy 21 is the cause of most Down syndrome. It is the most common chromosomal abnormality. Individuals with Down syndrome can experience varying degrees of intellectual developmental delay and have some distinctive physical features such as folds of skin that come lower over the eyes and short fingers and short toes. However, it's important to note that there is more variation in individuals with Down syndrome than there are similarities. So you can't lump all Down syndrome individuals into the same basket as far as their intellectual development and so on. Then there are other sex-linked abnormalities such as Turner syndrome. And sex-linked chromosomal abnormalities occur on the 23rd chromosome. And there are a number of these sex-linked chromosomes. The most common are Turner syndrome in females and Klinefelter's syndrome in males. Now, Turner syndrome occurs when there is only one X chromosome on the 23rd position. Now, some possible signs of Turner syndrome include being short, having a low hairline, no menstruation, and sterility. Turner syndrome is a chromosomal condition that affects development then in females. The most common feature of Turner syndrome is short stature, which becomes evident by the age of 5. An early loss of ovarian function is also very common. The ovaries develop normally at first, but egg cells usually die prematurely, and most ovarian tissue degenerates before birth. About 30% of women with Turner syndrome have an extra fold of skin on the neck, so they have a webbed neck, a low hairline at the back of the neck, and puffiness or swelling of hands and feet. Sometimes there are skeletal abnormalities as well as kidney problems. 1/3 to 1/2 of individuals with Turner syndrome are born also with a heart defect, where there is sometimes narrowing of the large artery leaving the heart, or abnormalities of the valves that connect the aorta with the heart. Then there is Klinefelter's syndrome. And Klinefelter syndrome is a chromosomal condition in boys or men that can affect physical and intellectual development. Most commonly, affected individuals are taller than average and are unable to father biological children, so they're infertile. However, the signs and symptoms of Klinefelter's vary among boys and men with this condition. In some cases, the features of the condition are so mild that the condition is not diagnosed until puberty or adulthood, and researchers believe that up to 75% of affected men and boys are never diagnosed. Now, testosterone is a hormone that directs male sexual development before birth and during puberty. Without treatment, the shortage of testosterone can lead to delayed or incomplete puberty, breast enlargement, so gynecomastia, decreased muscle mass, decreased bone density, and reduced amount of facial and body hair. And as a result of the small testes and decreased hormone production, affected males are infertile but they may benefit from some assisted reproductive technologies that can help them. Now, other physical changes associated with Klinefelter syndrome are usually subtle. For example, an unusually small penis can be associated with this. Older children and adults with the condition tend to be somewhat taller than their peers. Other differences can include abnormal fusion of certain bones in the forearm, curved pinky fingers, and flat feet. Children with Klinefelter syndrome may have low muscle tone and problems with coordination that may delay the development of motor skills such as sitting, standing, and walking. And affected boys can also have learning disabilities that can result in mild delays in speech development and language development and problems also with reading. Individuals with Klinefelter syndrome tend to have other emotional and physical problems, depression, impaired social skills, ADHD, increased likelihood of type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, hypotension, breast cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. Now, coming back again to genetic disorders in sex determination. So there are differences that can happen. Genetic disorders are associated with specific genes. Some are linked to dominant genes, such as Huntington's disease. Others, such as sickle cell anemia and cystic fibrosis, to recessive disorders. Beyond this are other sex-determinant genetic disorders, of which we've already talked about. Turner syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome are a part of those. But there are also genetic and sex-related disorders related to, like, for example, triple X females. So a woman with 3 X chromosomes experience normal development of sexual traits and are fertile, and this affects individuals who tend to be taller than average and tend to have slender builds, and the frequency of women attaining that extra X chromosome is approximately 1 in 1,000. Now, the phenotypical associations with having that 3rd X chromosome are not severe, but it can be related to slight learning disabilities. There can also, in males, be an X double Y. And here is where men inherit an additional Y chromosome, and they, again, are usually taller than average and are prone to acne because they produce higher than average levels of testosterone. The affected male is typically fertile, and many are unaware that they have this chromosomal abnormality. And again, the frequency of males born with an additional Y chromosome is approximately 1 in 1,000. Then there are genetically determined disorders of sexual differentiation, and these can be things like hermaphroditism, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and androgen insensitivity syndrome. So hermaphroditism, true hermaphroditism is a genetic condition in which the individuals have both mature ovarian and testicular tissue. Now, there are no published population-wide estimates of the frequency of hermaphroditism as far as I'm aware. The autosomal inheritance of this condition suggests that genes controlling sexual development and differentiation are not limited to the sex hormones themselves. But there are large geographical regions, perhaps, that have a relatively high frequency of true hermaphroditism. Then there is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And congenital adrenal hyperplasia is an inherited autosomal recessive condition that can affect both boys and girls, and it is its most common cause of intersexuality in females with the double X, 46. Where untreated, girls develop an outwardly male appearance, and this disorder is called androgenital syndrome, and it results from a genetically caused deficiency of cortisol, which is a steroidal hormone produced by the adrenal cortex. So here you get into the subtleties of hormones and how they can affect and impact how a person develops. So this disorder occurs with a frequency of about 1 in every 5,000 females and results in incomplete female sexual differentiation and an increased androgenic effect due to the compensatory increase in adrenocortical hormone. So basically what you have is a masculine female that does not have well-developed female sexual differentiation. Then there is androgen insensitivity syndrome. An androgen insensitivity syndrome is an X-linked recessive disorder in which the affected individuals have external female genitalia and breast development despite the fact that they are genetically male. They have an X and a Y chromosome. And tissues of affected individuals are unresponsive to male hormones, and yet they respond to estrogen. And so you have this expression that takes place prenatally, where there is development of female genitalia when there should have been, based upon the genetic factors, an expression of male genitalia. And then we come to gender assignment of intersex infants and children. And this is, again, a very difficult issue. Intersex is defined as a congenital anomaly of the reproductive and sexual systems, and it's estimated in its birth prevalence of intersex is about 1 in 2,000 children, or 1 child per day is visibly intersex that's born within the United States or North America. And that brings up, of course, all sorts of ethical issues, what to do. Do you surgically alter the neonate in order to select a sex development, or do you leave things as they are? Which has brought up lots of issues as throughout history. Okay, let's take a look at the basic stages of prenatal development as we kind of end out this lecture. So we start off with the germinal period, which begins at conception and continues until the organism is attached to the lining of the uterus, about 14 days. During that germinal period, cells first make copies, and then after reaching about 100 cells in number, begin to differentiate or specialize. And the failure rate of organisms during this period is quite high. So you have a failure rate in the germinal period of about 60 to 70%. Now, once the organism is embedded in the lining of the uterus, it's referred to as an embryo. And this lasts for from the 3rd through to the 8th week of development in the prenatal period. And during this period, all of the major structures of the body begin to form. And this development occurs in 2 directions. From the midlife onward, and from the head to the tail. So we know this as cephalocaudal development. So we're moving from the head to the tail. And the failure rate during this period is about 20%. So at the end of this stage, the embryo takes on a distinctively human appearance. The longest period of prenatal development is the fetal period, which begins in the 9th week after conception and lasts until birth. By the 12th week, the genitals are formed. Development of all structures of the body continue, and by the end of the 3rd month, the first trimester, all structures are present although, of course, they're immature. And the 4th through the 6th month, also known as the second trimester of pregnancy, is a pivotal time. Here you have reflexive action, sleep patterns develop, hearing and dramatic spurts of growth of the brain occur during this time period, and the fetus reaches the age of viability, or the first chance of surviving outside of the womb, at about 24 weeks after gestation. So during the last 3 months of development, the fetus then gains weight, and organ systems, particularly the digestive and respiratory systems, will continue to mature. And about 5% of fetuses fail during this period, usually before the 22nd weeks. Now, I want to just highlight something here which is fairly significant, and that is, in our modern age, teratology. The study of factors that can contribute to birth defects. And these include pollutants, it can include drugs, it can include harmful substances like alcohol, and sometimes maternal diseases. The risks associated with teratogens, which are these foreign substances that can disrupt development, can impact almost any area of development profoundly and significantly. The structures that are forming are very vulnerable, and a teratogen being introduced in these developmental phases can have profound, lasting effect for the entire life of the individual. It can disrupt key developmental stages that are so profound, like, for example, it can disrupt the closing of a skull, so a baby can be born without the top of their head. That would be an extreme case. It can end the life of the prenatal individual, or it can have profound effects upon later development. Now, the most commonly used teratogen in North America is alcohol, and the effects of alcohol are most significant if the mother drinks early in pregnancy, especially in the second month of development. Moderate to heavy drinking, so more than 2 to 3 drinks a day, have been associated with fetal alcohol damage. Some problems associated with fetal alcohol syndrome disorders include learning difficulties, impaired motor skills. For example, a newborn may have trouble sucking, a flattened nose, widely spaced eyes, a small head, long-term psychosocial problems such as social relationships problems, behavior problems in schools, neurological problems, kidney problems, bone problems, heart problems. Fetal alcohol syndrome disorders are the leading cause of intellectual developmental delay in North America. But alcohol is not the only teratogen. Tobacco is associated with stunted growth. A mother that smokes later in pregnancy can have low birth weight. There is placenta previa, which disrupts the structure of the placenta and can reduce the amount of oxygen getting to the child. It can result in sudden infant death syndrome. It can result in neurological problems associated with that have been associated with tobacco use. Then we, of course, need to consider prescription and non-prescription drugs as teratogens as well. Depending upon the type of drug, marijuana use, for example, is linked with neurological damage and ADHD. Other pollutants have been associated with neurological problems, deafness, that sort of thing. Cocaine use has a profound effect upon the fetus, can damage gastrointestinal and cardiac defects. within the child, within the fetus. So pregnancy is a very sensitive time for the prenatal child in development. And of course, so there's a lot of reliance upon the mother to protect and care for the prenatal individual. And we will leave it there, and we'll begin by next week by taking a look at pregnancy and childbirth. So I hope you enjoyed this week. You take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.